The Royal Navy without carriers. The Procurement Programme, 1957 to 1970. A 34-minute presentation held in the Dunkirk Lecture Theatre at the Joint Services Command Staff College, Shrivenham, on the 17th of October 2007. The speaker is Mr. Ben Jones.
Now, I really came to this topic because through my PhD, which I've recently finished, I looked at sort of air power logistics in the First World War and the Second World War, and clearly there's a lot of logistics involved in the ideas that we're looking at for the carrier operations and alternatives in this period. Now, I'm not going to look at it so much in that detail today as opposed to the whole debate about carrier procurement in the 1960s. And of course, there are three major themes which envelop this whole carrier procurement programme and military policy more generally, of course. What is Britain's national strategy? Is it east of Suez? Is it west of Suez? Is it NATO? And how that changes, and when, of course, that does changes, then, of course, the carrier force is imperilled quite considerably. The economic constraints, 7% were spent on GDP on defence in the 1960s, over 3 times what is spent today, but of course even that wasn't enough. And then looking at the east of Suez role, which is of course where a lot of the controversy arises in this period, should it be done by the Navy's carriers, as had been done or was proposed to be done, or should it be done by a series of island bases, which the RAF proposes in 1962. Now, of course, as far as the actual basic agreements that are made in the period, there are 3 sort of phases for negotiations about the future of this fleet carrier force. The announcement in July 1963 that the Navy will get 1 new fleet carrier. Not a whole programme, just 1 carrier. So the Navy appears to come out of that reasonably well, but there's many sort of underlying issues, which means that 3 years later, that is cancelled. And fleet carriers and the future of them until this year, there haven't been any ordered in the intervening period. There is then, of course, the argument about what you do with the remaining ships, and for various different reasons to some of the earlier arguments, HMS Ark Royal is then extended in service throughout the 1970s to the end of 1978, which is of the end of fleet carriers in the Royal Navy. We really have to go back to the Defence Review of 1957, when the first questions are raised about the future of the Fleet Air Arm, the fact there are new carriers perhaps going to be needed, and what role is it going to fulfil. And I think the first quote here is quite key in its key advantages, which are agreed really, regardless of other issues throughout the period, that it can apply air power in areas where other means cannot efficiently or economically be used. Air power has that key flexibility which otherwise land-based air power, certainly thinking in this period, cannot give more widely. Interestingly enough as well, and I mean I'm not sure if my research at present or what this was the case later, is the idea that maybe naval forces are going to have to be seriously reduced if you do want another fleet of carriers, because this is the most important unit in the fleet, and some evidence I've seen suggests that the Navy maybe wasn't willing to make enough sacrifices in this regard later on. It's certainly agreed in 1957 and again in 1961 that the future of carriers is a key part of British defence policy. The defence ministers keep coming back, the chiefs of staff keep coming back with the same answers. Now, what is the case? What Navy throughout this period from 1961, when again there's another defence review, through to 1966, does the Navy put on why we should have a fleet of aircraft carriers? All the existing 4 ships are going to be withdrawn in the early 1970s. There's going to be large expense. What is their utility? Well, I think the first one is probably the key as far as the Navy is concerned, and our argument's very much that, of course, since SDR, that we would make today, is the range of flexible and versatile options which carriers give to the UK government, and that they can act as a presence, they can be a deterrence, all the way up to the full warfighting role, and of course they are naturally geographically flexible. And I think that was probably the key one that the Navy looked at throughout the period. Also, there is from certainly 1961, a recognition that savings will have to be made in certain areas. And one way of doing this is suggesting having common Royal Navy, Royal Air Force future aircraft programs. Now, whether these are actually going to work, they didn't particularly work in the period, is another matter. But there was this idea the Navy put forward that these airfields are of national importance. So perhaps trying to get away from the purely naval and RAF debate. And what is proposed is by the Navy is what's called a Joint Seaborne Services Force, i.e. it will be probably a tri-service force, but the Navy will be at the heart of it with carriers and amphibious ships. Now, of course, the Navy also says for the air power roles that there are certain roles that only carriers can do. Large-scale fleet defence, also striking against enemy fleets and enemy shipping, and of course, what comes down perhaps to the key role, the defence of land forces against any sort of opposed amphibious landing. And it's within that regard that, of course, short-range aircraft are held out to be the key here, that only they can be deployed from carriers when they, of course, need to be available both for fleet defensive amphibious forces and for the landing themselves. And, of course, finally, and this is variously debated at times during the 1960s, what sort of ship, quite simply, do we need? And the Navy keep coming back to the idea that we need a full 53,000-ton fleet carrier, capable obviously of air defence, strike roles, and airborne early warning. And there are various suggestions put forward, really what would amount to a close support carrier by the RAF in the 1961, essentially a larger amphibious commando carrier, but capable of carrying, I guess what we would now have, Sea Harriers in sort of a strike role. But this at the period is ruled out because those type of aircraft are not available, and of course that sort of ship would not be able to carry out the full range of air power roles during that period. So when in successive defence reviews they're asked what type of carrier do you want, it is very much the full fleet carrier. Now, of course, a large part of the debate is the very intense inter-service rivalry between the Navy and the Air Force during this period. The RAF comes up with a series of arguments that, in fact, carriers are now outdated. They argue that they are subject to serious operational limitations. They can probably be on site for a few days at a time before going to have to refuel, replenish, maybe collecting replacement aircraft. They also, of course, highlight that of all these ships, for example, HMS Hermes, which is the smallest, can only carry 8 strike aircraft. So what military utility are you getting, keeping this force in being, when certain aircraft, which are going to have to be east of Suez in the Indian Ocean, only have a very limited capability? As the RAF might say, and working at Cranwell I hear no end of global reach and ubiquity and flexibility and rapid global mobility, they say, well, obviously a carrier can only move at 30 knots, will therefore be slow to respond in a crisis. Now, of course, the Navy would say, well, actually the carrier can move at 700 miles, whatever, a day, and hopefully the intelligence is sufficient for it to be on station, for it to have a presence throughout a crisis. Vulnerability. RAF say quite simply, carriers can be sunk. The longer range of land-based air forces makes them increasingly vulnerable. I think this is an interesting argument, and one you could also have today, because unless you're going to completely rule out the use of amphibious forces, then by taking away the carrier, you then make the rest of the naval forces, of course, very much more vulnerable. Today we have bought a new fleet of amphibious ships and have got rid of the Sea Harrier for fighter cover. And it's those ships which are the most vulnerable, so it really does apply, if you get rid of the carrier, to the rest of the fleet. As to the argument about its vulnerability, I'm not so sure at all that it was as vulnerable, or they were as vulnerable as the RAF were suggesting. And we then come down to really 2 key issues of this period. The idea of being cost effective, that you're going to have a huge expenditure. Each new carrier, if the Navy get their 4 that they wished in the early 60s, will cost 60 million each, plus obviously the requirement aircraft. And you're going to get for that limited, compared with if you invest in aircraft for the Royal Air Force, they consider modest operational capability. And there is also the argument, which increasingly impinges on this topic, about how likely are we that we're ever going to politically agree to, for example, an opposed amphibious landing. What are the political reasons behind why we actually need a carrier? What are its distinct roles? And these increasingly dissipate as the 60s go on. Now, of course, the alternative, having had their close support carrier, their Pike ship as it was known after Thomas Pike, the head of the Royal Air Force in the period, eventually rejected, the RAF come up with an alternative strategy for bases east of Suez. And this essentially is an island plan to have bases, you can see around here, sort of Mauritius, Gan, the Cocos Islands, Masseria, dotted around the Indian Ocean, from which, if you believe the ranges given there, land-based aircraft can provide air cover throughout that period. Now, of course, the slight problem, which I said at the bottom there, the availability of land bases is uncertain, is of course none of these bases really exist, certainly those there in the middle of the Indian Ocean, in addition to which, of course, you're depending on certain existing bases, like Aden and Singapore. Aden, of course, Britain withdraws from that in 1968, so there is a question mark over existing bases, which is the Navy's main argument, never mind the possible political ramifications for taking up more bases in the Indian Ocean at a time when we're actually withdrawing from empire. However, of course, it does offer a nice, cheap alternative. It's cost effective. The bases, well, there is a debate about everything in this period. The RAF say bases cost 5 million. The Navy say it will cost at least double that. The RAF say that, of course, we can have a fleet of F-111s for patrolling in this area. It'll cost 20% of the carrier force in the 10 years that we're going to look at. So it's going to be much cheaper. It'll be less vulnerable to attack. And I think the key, obviously, in a way, strength and weakness of the plan is this idea that these bases are effectively, when they're all established, if they're ever all established, will be staging posts, which can then be transformed by the flying in not only of strike aircraft, but of troops with transport into operational airfields at fairly short notice. And of course this depends on the availability of, and it's something I'm going to look into, for example, the number of transport aircraft, the ranges that you're flying, and of course the availability of all these staging posts. Because should you lose one, then you end up perhaps with the situation with Kuwait in 1961, where in theory, of course, the RAF could reinforce Kuwait faster than the Navy, but because of the problems of the availability of shore-based air, of overflight rights, the Navy actually gets there first. So this is, and the cost effectiveness, I think, is a very key point here. Now we come to these varying arguments that have been put forward in the early 1960s about why we still need carriers, about why perhaps an island stance in the east of Suez, and this is where now really the whole carrier debate is enmeshed with this east of Suez idea, comes to an announcement in 1963 which on paper, an agreement for a new fleet carrier for the Royal Navy, seems to have won the Navy to have won the argument. Of course, because of continuing and subsequently even more serious Treasury opposition, this is limited to only one ship. And as with everything, if you're not ordering the whole programme, then one ship, as happens later, can quite easily be cancelled. Now the Navy thinks that this one ship will lead, of course, to a full carrier programme of 4 ships, or at least 2 ships, but this doesn't happen. Again, the Navy is proposing, and it's part of the agreement, that there will have to be, what eventually, of course, comes to be the Harrier, more common aircraft programs. The amount being spent on aircraft development in this period is extremely high, and some contingencies in the budget will have to be made to pay for even just this one carrier. Now, why do you have to make the decision in 63? Well, the ageing nature of the carrier force and the fact that you need 3 carriers minimum, as an absolute minimum, to have just one ship east of Suez in the 1970s on the basis that British commitments in Malaya, Singapore at this stage are still lasting until probably 1980. So the rest of the fleet is going to start to fall apart in the early 70s. You need at least one more ship to accompany that. And obviously you then need the lead-in time for design, and with the ship then possibly being actually ordered, building starting in 1966. And you still have the idea, I think, throughout this, that the carrier is recognised as the most flexible instrument of conventional war. And of course all the steps down from that for political pressure, political manoeuvring, having a naval or a British presence, etc. And while there are pressures in the programme, these ideas are still recognised. However, things start to change, certainly against the carrier programme and the Navy, quite rapidly after this. You have the Minister of Defence, no less, actually writing to the Prime Minister on the 1st of January 1964, saying the Treasury is refusing to allow any funds even for the design of the ship. So the Treasury said, yes, we will allow you to have one ship, and then proceeded to not have them any money for even the design, never mind the long lead items. So this is a serious problem for actually the practical design of that one ship in 1963, 1964. However, you then come to, I think, what is the crunch moment for the whole carrier programme when the Labour government comes to power in 1964. It is an increasing balance of payments and other financial difficulties, and it decrees that British defence spending, which had been running at 7% in the early 60s, will have to run at 5% by 1970. So rather than £2,400 million on defence in 1970, at a stroke, it's 2,000 million. So this is no longer salami slicing the defence budget. Some pretty big things here are going to have to go. And it's a question of will it be the carriers or what other things are actually sort of expendable. The Air Ministry campaign in this period, they have the island plan, the island stance on the table, but is very much more towards arguing that given these few contingencies in which we may have to use fleet carriers, that in fact they're just simply not cost effective, and they produce reams of documents to illustrate the fact that the cost that the carriers will cost, and of course any supporting aircraft, and as they would regard, of course, then supporting escorts, logistical shipping, is going to be very, very expensive indeed. And given the amount of times we're going to have to use it, which of course is the totally unpredictable scenario, that the carriers are expendable. I think it's also interesting as well that earlier on the Navy had insisted that clearly carriers were a key part of the fleet, of naval warfare, and the overseas strategy. And I guess because of the intensity of the argument in this period, the carriers actually then become much more linked into the East of Suez commitment itself. So the Navy then argues we need to retain this commitment, so for example at least a 3-carrier fleet, as long as these commitments actually exist. Obviously then leaving itself open to the problem that should the government then say, well, these commitments don't exist, then it can then go through and cancel the whole programme. So I think in some ways the Navy slightly boxes itself in and then realised later actually how important these ships actually are. So you come to the agreement, well, the decision in 1966 that essentially when it comes to the moment when the carrier would have to be ordered, that in fact it will be cancelled. Essentially for economic reasons, I can't see there's any way that the carriers, or certainly a fleet of them, would have been viable within the defence budget of that period. That's not to say, of course, that they still would play, in certain circumstances, a key role. I think the interesting thing politically is that the government decides in 1966 that East of Suez commitments, and at this time it still looks until the end of the 1970s, will be retained, but if necessary, it will be without carriers. When the existing force of ships in the early 1970s is withdrawn, then we're going to do it, probably, although of course these bases never get built, essentially supported by the RAF's island strategy. And this probably was for them, given the budget limits that they've set, probably the only political choice. The Navy suggests, well, either you've got to keep the carrier and essentially increase the defence budget, or you're going to have to abandon the East of Suez commitments altogether. It's not so much exactly about the carrier, but about obviously linking in our capabilities to commitments. And I think there's a very good quote from Christopher Mayhew, who is the last the Minister of the Navy in January 1966, who says, I would accept that if the political situation develops exactly on the lines we have laid down, if for the first time ever the forces are not asked to deal with situations we haven't planned for, if the Air Force can in fact provide air cover hundreds of miles away, equivalent to mounting patrols over northern Italy from bases in England, with aircraft not yet in service and techniques as yet untried, And if we can be sure that usable land bases, free from attack, will always be conveniently available, we could theoretically do without carriers. And I think really, of course, that highlights the Navy's key concern that it will be asked to do operations, perhaps subsequently, with, of course, its continuing amphibious forces, which are then not supported by air cover. What does the government do? As I say, it's linked in its commitments. The Navy is saying, what are the commitments? Well, the government is saying we will not undertake military operations without allies. Essentially, we will not do opposed amphibious landings without land-based air cover. And it accepted that, in fact, for certain roles, the carrier could do these, especially fleet protection and others, better than RAF aircraft and, for example, new generation of naval missiles which were coming into service. But despite that, the carriers had to go. So their actual utility is still recognised, but quite simply the government says we will not intervene in another country unless they provide us with airfields and facilities first in the Far East, and we will not intervene in a serious military operation unless we have land-based air cover. And of course, if they say those parameters, then of course they can, I guess, then cancel the carrier programme. Of course, the problem, as Dennis Healy with that point about amphibious landings, and when you look, of course, at the Falkland experience, I think is quite notable. He says, now there is one job which nothing but a carrier can ever do, and that is give air cover to forces which are landing on hostile soil against sophisticated air attack outside the range of our own land-based aircraft. We decided that this was an element of our capability we could afford to forego. So exactly what would happen in San Carlos was ruled out on a worldwide scale by him in the 60s. It is interesting because the East of Suez then really, I think, exemplifies the whole of the Navy's sort of worldwide role, and perhaps other tasks are forgotten. Now, of course, having said that, we're going to do the East of Suez role until the end of the 70s. Within 2 years, the whole role collapses. In 1967, so shortly afterwards, going to withdraw from East of Suez by 1975, rapidly followed by the devaluation of the pound and the need for further huge budget cuts in the armed forces. So literally within 18 months of the carriers being cancelled, in January 1968, essentially Foreign Office ministers have to go to Malaysia, Singapore, and announce that the whole East of Suez role ends in 1971. And of course, with that, any proposals for island stance, the RAF F-111s, also go the same way. Now, of course, having said we don't want any new carriers, this then creates problems with the existing force, because the government says, well, certainly until 1971, 1972, we still need 2 carriers, possibly in that East of Suez role, out of perhaps only 3 which are available. And there is then further Treasury resistance, even on then to the refit of the last real fleet carrier, due for a refit in this period, HMS Ark Royal. This is essentially then overruled by the Foreign Office because they say, well, we don't know what will happen, what resistance there may be, what difficulties we may encounter when withdrawing from Malaysia, Singapore, etc. in the early 1970s. So having said a couple of years before, we're really going to rule out serious military operations, there then comes back to the thought that these may well occur and we then may need to retain those ships. In light of a lot of the previous arguments, there are then some interesting arguments in 1970 about the decision to keep Ark Royal in service for another 6 years, essentially, until the end of the 1970s. The value for money argument then, of course, is turned on its head, because £30 million has already been spent on refitting the ship, and how cost effective is that to keep her in service for 2 years? But then, of course, there are 2 much bigger issues which have not really been concerned with in this period, which then raise their head. The Navy had essentially said, carriers are essential to East of Suez. If we don't need them for those commitments, or this is certainly the overwhelming impression they had given, then we don't need them. What they discover, of course, with this very rapid drawdown East of Suez, the prospect of no carriers by 1972, is we have no air cover, we have no long-range strike capability. Surface-to-surface guided missiles, the Exocet, for example, are not in service. So essentially we need some actually maritime strike fleet protection capability in addition to an expeditionary one. Also, the whole idea of keeping her, one of the major planks, is to ironically ease NATO anxieties about British commitments elsewhere, the continuing East of Suez commitments, the problems in Northern Ireland, the withdrawal of troops from the British Army of the Rhine, to deal with that. So the actual NATO west of Suez commitments, which had not been previously considered, all of a sudden rise their head at the beginning of the 1970s. And I think to come back to the point I sort of made earlier on about how was the Navy going to pay for this, even then to pay for the Ark Royal still being in service, some ships were decommissioned early, a proposed new helicopter carrier had to be cancelled. So just a quick summary then. I think throughout the period, despite the yo-yoing arguments about should carriers be ordered, I think there is a recognition from Healy, the Defence Minister in '66, and others about the unique flexibility and potential roles that carrier air power could do. That the island stance, of course, the RAF has a massive advantage in the arguments in this period because they can say, well, for example, the Hermes, the smallest carrier you have, is not very operationally capable, where, of course, the Navy has no counter-arguments, for example, towards the RAF's island stance, because these aircraft, these bases, these operations haven't been conducted, and therefore criticism of them is fairly impossible. Of course, it is also interesting in this period that you get probably the most intensive carrier operations since, I guess, the Second World War, or certainly the demand for the availability of those. In 1963, because of the confrontation with Indonesia and other incidents in the Far East, the government says we need 2 carriers on station in the Far East at any one time, at probably the moment with only 4 carriers, when the Royal Navy since the Second World War is least able to do that. But there is effectively in the arguments, obviously the RAF can have ammunition from certain commitments, whereas the Navy doesn't have any. And just raising the point there, I think really it is the economic pressures which it did for the whole of Britain's east of Suez commitment, and which did for the carrier force, which did for the F-111s, which did for the TSR-2, and other projects in the Air Force as well in 1955, 1956. But whatever the arguments, which are well made about the flexibility, the versatility, the contingency that carriers give you, the money simply wasn't there. Had the Navy, as I've read in a couple of papers, decided, well, maybe 1/3 of our escort force has to go because the carriers are the key to future naval capability, then things may have been different. But as far as I'm aware, those sort of perhaps drastic cuts may be necessary weren't offered. And I think the interesting point for myself, and probably in future research on this, is that both of those military solutions, the carrier force east of Suez or the island stance, posed formidable logistical problems, certainly to their continuing. The RAF, for example, said that, well, if we withdraw from these bases, and therefore we're saying we may be able to have a carrier presence but no island stance, but the Navy also, of course, needs dockyards, it needs air bases to effectively maintain its carrier force east of Suez. There's a paper by the Flag Officer Aircraft Carriers, Rear Admiral Janvrin, in 1966, February, a few weeks before the decision to cancel the carriers, and he says that in fact the air groups, the aircraft carriers must be trained up west of Suez, essentially in Britain, because the facilities in the Far East simply don't exist. And the problems with having to, for example, with HMS Victorious, where the entire crew and aircrew were changed in the mid-1960s, to keep her on station meant effectively she was a lot less capable because the facilities to work her up, both the ship and the aircraft, were not there.
Mr. Jones was asked the following 3 questions. Question 1. Why was the Navy so far off the mark with this issue?
Well, I think, of course, because the basis of their planning from 57, after the sort of the failures for effective amphibious forces and stuff in Suez in 56, had been based on the Far East. And that was what their whole capability of having this sort of joint services support force had been based on. They do seem to be really drawn in, certainly after 63 to 66, when the pressure really is on, to really nailing the carriers with east of Suez. When, of course, the whole thing unravels, and the problem is that in 3 years you're not going to have any aircraft carriers, they're saying, well, there's all these naval roles, fleet roles, doesn't matter where you are, for which carriers are really important. I think they really do nail it to that mast. And then, of course, the problem is when the government says, well, we're going to rule out most of the operations, like the, as Healy said, the opposed amphibious landing against a hostile air force. If as a government you rule those out, then you probably can rule out certain capabilities.
Question 2. What enduring lessons can we extract that are applicable now in the debate about carriers, and in the general debate about capability versus commitment.
Well, I think in many ways the same arguments apply now as did then. The Navy's argument about the utility, the flexibility of carriers, which of course now in the SDR and in government policy is accepted, that we may have to operate all around the world, were exactly the same then. I think the unique thing here is that, well, not unique, but with a massive defence cut in this period, while it's recognised that we're going to severely constrict ourselves in what we can do east of Suez, even though in 1966 the sort of ending in 1971 isn't even on the horizon, that we're going to really constrict ourselves in what we can do, and we're going to just withdraw that whole capability. So I don't think that the reasons for having carriers haven't changed. But obviously it's fitting within overall government policy. And of course you also have, I guess now, the recognition, ironically going back to Admiral Lamb, the first Sea Lord, his thinking in sort of 1961 about having common RAF, RN aircraft and this sort of joint services seaborne force, that it was essentially tri-service. That is essentially what we've moved to. I think really the whole question here of the cancellation is economic. Whether, I say, the Navy could have made other cuts which would have made it more palatable, but I think the way they really orientated it to east of Suez, clearly the government saw if we reduce those commitments, then it can go.
Question 3. Do you think that not investing a large proportion of the defence budget into new carriers has allowed a more balanced fleet?
I think it should depend on where your emphasis is in the fleet. And if you consider this to be the key to a large number of fleet operations, and the problem of, I guess losing escort and then maybe the roles that they can do is a problem. And the Marines obviously is always an issue as to who wants them, and the investment in them in the Navy, in the naval budget, is where is the emphasis? Because I think actually, because we've had no proper carrier for nearly 30 years, then we've forgotten what they can actually do. And therefore, for example, when you get to the Second Gulf War, Ark Royal, what can a relatively small number of Harriers, I guess, effectively do compared with the rest of the Allied commitment. So therefore, she's re-rolled as a Marine carrier. And that we may find us using carriers a lot more when we've got them. But again, that's just where the priorities are. And are they, as it was said in the 57 Defence Review, these are the key part of the naval effort. And, as with all sort of defence reviews and, economics considerations, you're going to have to cut something else. And the question is, what do you cut? I mean, they're easier to cut because they're really big and they're really expensive. Especially the carriers, because I think now the argument, because I get quite often, working at Cranwell, get asked quite often, will we get the carriers? And I say, well, the argument's the other way around. If you order the JSF, which costs $10 billion, and you're going to have a new fleet of airborne early warning aircraft, they actually cost the money. It is not the carriers, which, $4 billion, but they don't cost the majority of the money. It is actually the aircraft. And of course, you have really the aircraft in service in this period, so the emphasis is not so much on aircraft programs as well as the carriers.
Mr. Jones can be contacted by email at bjones-kcl@cranwell.raf.mod.uk.